Okay, folks, thanks very much for coming out. Let me first of all introduce the panel. Don Purvis, a former MLA, former leader of the Progressive Unionist Party, and did some brilliant work with a document called Call to Action, which was looking at educational underachievement in our schools. Beside her is Ian Marshall, a former president of the Ulster Farmers Union and now a senator in Leinster House, and probably now realising that he can get a table at any restaurant in New York through that sense of confusion. And at the end is Sophie Long, again a former activist with the PUP, and now I think based in England with the Joseph Rowntree Trust. And my name is Mike Nesbitt, and if you look at my latest CV, you will see that every single bullet point starts with the same 4 short, sad words, which are, Mike used to be. So I want to thank Féile for the opportunity to pretend I'm still important for an hour or so this evening. We'll try and keep the opening remarks quite short. The theme is Reimagining Unionism, which fascinates me because I'm not quite sure what it means. I'm not sure what needs to be reimagined, and perhaps more particularly, I'm not sure whether it means that we have to reimagine and represent ourselves to you, or whether you have to reimagine what you think of us. And hopefully we might get a bit of clarity over the course of this discussion. Dawn, would you like to say a few opening words?
Certainly. Do you want me up here, or are you happy enough that I'm here? Seated?
Go.
Can you hear me now?
Hello.
Hello. Yep. Thanks very much, and thanks to Claire for badgering me to take part in this discussion today. It really, I suppose the idea came from a panel discussion that I took part in last year around women and the Good Friday Agreement. And I was talking about how lost I felt as a unionist and a pro-Remain unionist because of the outcome of the referendum. And I suppose that the leaders of unionism no longer, and probably didn't ever, to be fair, represent my brand of unionism because both parties were pro-Brexit, and really that wasn't me. So the title Reimagining Unionism gave me some food for thought. And like Mike, I thought, well, to reimagine something, you must imagine what it looks like in the first place. And what do you imagine it looks like in the first place? If you're throwing at the us, then to come up with, a new vision for unionism and what that might look like. But I took, as I always do, I deconstructed the question and looked at the subtext of the question. The panel will consider the implications for Brexit and the politics here. That's 1. It will also explore alternative visions for unionism. That's 2. And what does it mean to be a unionist in this new context? So for me, it's a 3-part discussion and 3-part debate. And so I've been pondering about this now for quite some time. And for me personally, I think the implication for Brexit and politics here is a disaster. I think economically, socially, politically, and culturally, it's an isolationist policy that feeds a really negative and destructive brand of English nationalism. I think that's what it was born out of, and that's what it's meant to feed, and we're expected to fit in with that. And I think, hating people because they're not the same as you, or they come from a different place or a different country, or practice a different religion or none, or they have difficult communicating, or they're poor, or they're uneducated, or they're not very healthy, is to me the antithesis of unionism, and the antithesis of my unionism. Try saying that with your teeth in. Because it's not my unionism, and it's not my brand of unionism. So I think that Brexit is a disaster for the union, it's a disaster for unionism, and it's a disaster for these 2 islands. And I'm really fearful of how that is going to be played out post-Halloween with the scary Prime Minister that we have. In terms of alternative visions of unionism, as I said, that already implies that you imagine what unionism is. And I can understand that people who are not unionists would have a view or would have an opinion or could imagine a unionism that is anti-Catholic, anti-Islam, anti-atheism, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women, anti-choice, anti-Irish language, anti-GAA, anti-all things Irish for that matter. And if that's what you imagine unionism to be, and when I say you, I mean anyone who's not a unionist, or what you imagine a unionist utopia to be like, then exclude me, because I've just described my unionist dystopia. It's an awful, brutal place that people are trying to escape from. And that, again, is not my brand of unionism. That's not the type of society that I want to live in. It's the complete opposite of that. It's a society that is at peace with itself, built on equality and human rights, and a place where no one wants to leave. So what does it mean to be a unionist in this new context? So isolationism doesn't work, and it hasn't worked for unionism, and we can see that. Unionist votes are going down, and more unionists are not coming out to vote. That's the biggest telling sign, I think, in the electorate. Acting like Millwall supporters and saying, well, if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else, is really not grown-up politics. And I think if you really believe in the United Kingdom, then you have to make it work for everybody and not just your mates. And I think that what has been portrayed as unionism over the last couple of years since the Brexit referenda has really done unionism a massive disservice. And it's certainly not something that I could align myself with, and not something that I could agree with. Thanks.
Ian, do you want to pull the mic?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, with the permission of the chair, I'd like to stand up because it's very hard to talk when you're sitting down. And it's not that I think I need to stand up to leave this lecture theatre quickly. I don't think there's anything not contentious. And if I'm away from the microphone, I could try and shout. Firstly, thanks for the invitation to join you here. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I've watched what's been going on in Féile this last few days, and it's some interesting debates and discussions. And it's interesting because even though Brexit is absorbing most of our time and our energy, it will pass, and whatever comes, we'll deal with it. Good or bad, the sky won't fall in, so we'll just have to take what we get, and get on with it. So when I was asked about this title, and I sort of sat down to think about sort of what you could say in 5 minutes about the title. So the implications of Brexit have the potential to be far-reaching, and what we've done over the last 3 years will change and have changed the relationship between Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, UK, and Europe. And whether they remain as a collective or whether the UK goes a separate way to forge a path as an independent state, we'll have to deal with the fallout. For this reason, I don't plan to focus this evening on speculation about Brexit, but I'm happy to share my opinions in any Q&A session on the implications or an alternative vision for the future regarding Brexit. So when we consider the title, Reimagining Unionism, if you look up the dictionary definition of imagine, it'll tell you that it means to form a mental image. It means to believe or fancy or to think, to assume or suppose, to conjecture or guess. So to reimagine is to do the aforementioned again. That's a big mistake. As we sit here this evening, rather than reimagining unionism, I'd ask you if you know what it is to be a unionist, or do you think you know what it is to be a unionist? When I was elected last year to the Seanad, I was doing an RT interview in the plinth at Leinster House. And the interviewer has a final curveball question. In the middle of a debate on abortion, he asked me where I stood on abortion. My reply, pro-choice, always have been, always will be. There followed a stunned silence, and the story that was never was. And shocked, one of my colleagues whispered, where the hell did that come from? You're a Presbyterian. No Presbyterians do pro-choice. Hence the problem. He thought he knew what it was to be a Presbyterian, and I've no doubt that he thought he knew what it was to be a unionist, but he didn't. I was travelling lately and I picked up a book going through the airport out of Dublin, and the book was called The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Leftery. Actually, it's a very good read and I'd recommend it to anyone, but here's the point and here's the connection. As I read about the struggle to escape the tyranny of Syria, by a family from Aleppo, a thought occurred to me. We've all become accustomed to labelling people. Many of us have come guilty of referring to migrants, whilst forgetting that they're individuals, they're human beings with personas, with personalities and characters, with strengths and weaknesses, good sides and bad, but most importantly, like ourselves, with brothers, sisters, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters. It's too easy to dehumanise a group and reduce them to a fairly benign collective. And here's the connection. In Northern Ireland, we've all become conditioned to grouping and labelling people. You're a Protestant or you're a Catholic, you're a nationalist or a unionist, you're a loyalist or you're a Republican. It's become very convenient to apply prejudices and preconceptions, to know what they think, to know what they want, and to know how they feel, but we don't. Unionism, like nationalism, like Catholicism and Protestantism, has changed and will continually evolve as the world evolves. In my opinion, it's better to understand the other side than to try and change to fit or to reimagine it as it's something that it's not. Starting points to understand unionism, to understand what it means to be a unionist. Despite the fact that the perception is a fairly narrow-minded, intolerant, conservative group of individuals stuck in the past, the opposite is more reflective of unionists in 2019. They tend to be quite liberal, open-minded, forward-thinking and welcoming. Interestingly, most have no issues whatsoever with LGBT rights, same-sex marriage, abortion, etc. And to believe it or not, most of our unionist colleagues are Remainers, which you may be surprised to learn. The difficulty has been more the fact that they haven't been particularly good at communicating this message to those outside unionism. Something I'm acutely aware of in Northern Ireland, but also I'm aware of it in Dublin. In fact, there's a serious piece of work to get all the people on the island of Ireland to understand each other, their heritage, their values, and their aspirations. I was recently surprised to listen to a fellow senator from County Mayo state on a podcast that when they first met me in Leinster House, they hadn't realised there were any Presbyterians in South Armagh. And my retort to that, that's exactly the way we wanted. You never know we're there. So don't judge unionism or loyalism through a political prism, or through the stories you've read on social media or the sound bites from hand-picked individuals to drive headlines, because this is not a true reflection. Judge unionism and loyalism by the men and women you meet every day in work, in leisure and recreation or sport, or by the normal daily engagement, because this is how I judge nationalism and this is how I judge republicanism. This debate isn't about reimagining unionism, it's about understanding, accepting and respecting the ism, whether it's unionism, nationalism, loyalism, republicanism, Protestantism or Catholicism. Mutual respect and parity of esteem is something unionists aspire to as well as nationalists. It's something that will underpin relationships in Northern Ireland as we try to build a shared future. Truly understanding and respecting each other's culture is part of this. Not agreeing with, maybe not supporting, but understanding and respecting different perspectives. Now, I'm a bit like a long playing record when I continually quote Atticus Finch from the Harper Lee novel To Kill a Mockingbird. It's my favourite book. And in it he says, to understand someone, you've got to get inside their skin and walk around in it. And it's something that applies to Protestants, to Unionists and to Loyalists, as it does to Catholics, to Nationalists and to Republicans. Furthermore, do Unionists understand Republicans? Because the reality is, in my experience coming from that community, when you speak to Northern Unionists about a Republican, there's an association built on the history and the legacy of the Troubles, that it's a balaclava and it's an Armalite. And there's a perception that a Republican is anti-Brit, anti-Prod, anti-Union in Northern Ireland. And a question, when I went to Leinster House, I have lots of good friends who are Irish Republicans. They don't present any threat to me, to my culture, to my heritage, my people, my family. There is no threat. They're political animals. They don't pose any threat to me. And the question I would like to ask is, have Republicans explained exactly what they are? Have they explained sufficiently what they are, or what they represent, or what their aspirations are? There's many conversations around civic unionism at the moment. And as we speak, where the debate is about embracing language and culture, it's about the sense of being of Irishness while not compromising your sense of Britishness, where I've actually listened to one individual describe himself as constitutionally British and culturally Irish, which is an interesting concept to consider. And I've listened last week to some of the language around Irish unity and the conversation around many of the venues in the Féile. I've heard on one occasion that everything must be on the table. which it must be. We must have a fully transparent, open, inclusive conversation regarding all the realities around governance, health, education, security, business, affordability before there's any poll. And we must recognise that Irish unity may not be something that would work if it was forced upon society in a 50+1 referendum. That Irish unity works when all agree it's the right solution. This isn't actually about the mechanism to trigger of a 50+1, but rather about the impact and the ability to deliver Irish unity on this basis. I've listened to language last week, such as the train has left the station, on the Irish unity discussion. And it has left the station. It has as regards the debate, but as yet we definitely don't know the destination. Whether that destination is union or unity, it's not clear yet. But most importantly, in order to ensure that the train is not derailed, everyone, yes, everyone must be on the train. And be under no illusion, some of the language over the weekend will definitely not get everyone on this train and doesn't help the discussion. So in conclusion, we don't need to reimagine unionism post-Brexit. We don't need to reimagine nationalism post-Brexit. We don't actually need to imagine anything. We need to believe in a shared future together with mutual respect and parity of esteem for all in a place we can all call home.
Is that okay? Is that working all right? Thanks very much to the Féile for inviting me again. Almost made to feel very welcome and very happy to be on such a gender balanced panel and to get to listen to Dawn. So thank you. Yeah, rethinking unionism. Where can unionism go from here? Because any political ideology needs to adapt to its circumstances or it will die out. It needs to offer people something for them to kind of believe in it and stand behind it. And as we saw at the last European and council elections, unionism's finding it difficult to present a compelling vision of the future to its traditional voter base. So I was thinking through this and I was reading a book by a guy called Norman Porter, who wrote a book called Rethinking Unionism back in '96. And at the time he'd set out the three biggest threats to unionism, and they haven't actually changed. He kind of envisaged that Europe might pose a bit of a problem, so he was kind of right there. But so the three biggest threats to unionism remain internal fractures, disunity and challenge. And the solution to that is absolutely not to have one unionist party, but it's to have more room for dissent within unionism. The second threat, the actions of others in the island of Ireland. So that's normally the Irish state and how that behaves towards Northern Ireland. And that context is very different now than it was in '96. And then the actions and behaviour of those outside of Ireland. And he kind of narrowed it down quite closely to Westminster, to the kind of untrustworthy British government. So they're the three biggest threats to unionism. However, and if we think about trying to capture the imaginations, the political imaginations of not just young voters, but all voters now, knowing what we know about what is going on in the world, the three biggest threats to humanity, Nick Bostrom has a really good book on this called Superintelligence, and he kind of theorizes quite a lot about the existential threats we face. Climate disaster, so we won't have enough food, we won't have enough land, we won't be able to survive in the climate we've created for ourselves. Artificial intelligence will wipe us out, and we'll kill ourselves with the nuclear weapons that we've created to kill other people with. So they're the three really gripping challenges that humanity has to wrestle with. So when you look at those two kind of things, you can see that unionism thinks locally, thinks in terms of the very near future risks to itself, and that kind of shapes some of the limitations of the political programs that it ends up engaging in. And Irish nationalism and Irish republicanism is very invigorated at the minute, is on a march towards something, and therefore it can galvanise people and bring them along. And that is an existential threat to unionism as a political entity. Not to unionism as an identity, because it can survive. Irishness has survived in Northern Ireland or the North. But like what I don't fully understand is like why we haven't been planning for this. So Northern Ireland was supposed to be a temporary solution. It was carved out of the island of Ireland to, you know, settle a disgruntled minority of people for a brief period of time. And Lloyd George told Collins that this will just be a temporary thing. You know, we can deliver Ulster for Ireland, and we'll get them to agree to it. So unionism sort of knew that this wouldn't last forever, but regardless, never tried to earn the authority that it had in Northern Ireland. So governed with coercion or force, calling on the parent state of Great Britain to bring the army in when they couldn't manage with the police. So therefore, unionism, because of how it's operated since 1921, has a huge legitimacy deficit. And I think when you kind of watch the defensive posturing of some unionist leaders, you can see that they're not quite willing to wrestle with that, to acknowledge that they never came to terms with the fact that they didn't earn the right to govern. So therefore, if we see ourselves as progressive or critical or civic unionists, how can we address this? Well, the union itself is a weird beast because it's not a symmetrical relationship. So as you can see from the debates on a border poll, like Westminster has much more say over the future of Northern Ireland than we have over ourselves. So it's up to a Secretary of State to gift us a border poll or not. We cost, it's either between 10 and 12 billion a year more than we raise in rates and taxes. So we're in a relationship of unequals, and for unionism looking towards Great Britain, they want to be valued, cherished, made feel safe, reassured, but repeatedly they're kind of treated like, you know, an unwanted child or a problem until recently when they're able to offer something of use. So why are we in this kind of union of unequals? Why aren't we an equal partner in this? Well, what's valued by the current British government? They care about GDP, they care about war and the money that war can make, and they care about very low corporation tax. So what can Northern Ireland really bring to the table in terms of that? We can offer great literature, beautiful landscapes, resilient people, funny people, but we can never bring back our industrial output, the 36th Ulster Division, and the unquestioning loyalty to empire that we once offered. So we can never quite reach the status that we once had to be welcome in the union. So therefore, we need to become comfortable with being critical about the history of the British Empire, how Northern Ireland was formed, and what unionists gained from being part of that unequal relationship. So how did unionism benefit from the Orange State? Why didn't more working class unionists fight for civil rights for everybody in the 60s? Why did and do some accept grinding poverty as an acceptable alternative to Irish rule? Who are the unionist women that we value and cherish? Where are the accounts of unionist womanhood? What are the limits of our loyalty? Like, when will we say no and break the ties? What has a union done for me or anybody here that is a unionist? And the really difficult questions, so like, we've never properly had a public conversation about this in Northern Ireland, and I often ask Republicans to do it in the context of arguing for Irish unity, but what were the structural causes of Irish Republican violence? Where did that come from? Why, with the exception of just a few, one of whom is here, did unionism enact harm on British women by denying them British rights? Why did that go on for so long? So therefore, like, is unionism able to reorient itself in a post-imperial, post-industrial, post-conflict setting on a burning planet? And if not, what is its purpose? And I don't obviously have the answers to those things because they're very difficult, but those are the questions we're going to have to ask if we're to become a legitimate political movement.
Okay, folks, I have been asked to be a participating chair, which sounds horribly like Stephen Nolan. But I'm not going to let that stop me. So just before we go for your question and comments, I'd like to just comment on a couple of what I think are the important points. I couldn't agree more with Sophie. There can't be a single unionist party. Nobody speaks for unionism. Yes, the DUP are the largest party of political unionism, but they do not speak for all unionism. And my fear for unionism is summed up by a story which a guy called Charles Handy tells about a particular type of frog. The characteristic of this frog is if you put it in a pan of cold water and slowly, really, really slowly, heat that water to boiling point, the frog dies because it doesn't recognize that the environment around it is changing in a way that represents an existential threat. And unionism needs to realize the environment is changing. The demographics here in Northern Ireland are changing. There is Scottish nationalism. Above all, there is now English nationalism. So we need to be aware of these things. And English nationalism, as Dawn suggested, drove Brexit. And another fear I have is that Brexit will prove to be unionists' greatest ever own goal. I can see it leading to the breakup of the union. I can see Scotland going first. And if they get a second referendum and they fight it on in or out of Europe rather than simply in and out of the UK, I believe they'll win. At which point English nationalism could well look here and say, we're giving you £12 billion a year and nearly half of you don't want to be members of the UK. I tell you what, we'll build an acute hospital instead. All the best. And it's about identity. We focus on the border and on trade and tariff, and these things are important, absolutely. But it's about identity, and as Ian said, identity isn't necessarily a binary. I don't believe there are that many pure Gaels or pure Brits on this island. If I mention the name Henry Joy McCracken, I'm not imagining many of you are going to start Googling him on your smartphone. Okay. But his parents were traders in Belfast, one an Ulster Scot, one a Huguenot. Nesbitt is a Huguenot name. My mum's a Hay, she's an Ulster Scot, and for many years we were traders in the city of Belfast. And there is a Republican icon and a former unionist leader. Both Presbyterians, by the way, although I no longer call myself a Presbyterian after what the church did to the LGBT community a couple of years ago. But I do consider myself, as John Hewitt said, to be an Ulsterman, but also Irish, British, and European. And as he warned, deny me any part of that mix, and you diminish who I am. And that is what Brexit has done to too many people on this part of this island. Sir, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. Before I ask the question, I'm going to express regret that yourself and Dawn are not leaders of your parties and don't want to do formal parties. I think that's a real loss for Northern Irish politics. My question is, what can, in terms of liberal unionism, civic unionism, progressive unionism, what can nationalism in general or republicanism in particular do to foster, to encourage that these varieties of unionism which can engage and have something to offer not only people in Northern Ireland, but people in the rest of Ireland?
I think the step that I would like to see next is a development from the emergence of this civic nationalist group, which has seen a civic unionist group come together. What I want to see is one civic group. And I was at a meeting last week, which was very broad, from iconic figures in republicanism and some big names in loyalism. And there was an agreement that perhaps a focus that we could have as a sort of work program would be to encourage the two groups to come together. Because if you can get one civic group together, my God, how much are we going to find out we agree on? Yeah.
I'm still thinking. Do you want to
Just Chair, can we ask people to identify themselves and if they're with a party or?
Okay.
Oh, right.
My name is Robert Perry. I'm just a citizen and I'm not on the party. Party bottom.
It's interesting because, just as Mike said, after the waterfront event, which was well attended, very successful event, Nell Murphy and the guys were down at Leinster House, and I met them just over having coffee. And I said, great event, guys, but you failed horribly. And they said, well, why did we fail? I said, because you had no unionist in the conversation. And on the back of that, for my outburst, I got invited to the Canal Court event in Uri, which, remember, was about 500 Republicans in the Canal Court in Uri. But it was a fascinating debate. It was an interesting conversation. And I'm sure there were a lot of things learned by the audience and by myself about the audience. But the interesting thing is, as Mike says, there's a conversation happening at the moment with civic unionists. And it's a conversation about it's okay to be engaging the Irish language, engaging culture, engaging music, engaging the history and the heritage, without feeling that you're undermining or devaluing your Britishness or your identity or that of your colleagues. So that conversation is happening, and exactly as Mike said, my point has always been that if you're going to have civic dialogue, you can't have civic nationalist and Republican dialogue and civic unionist and loyalist dialogue. I was at a meeting, I was invited to a talk in the Stormont Hotel last Tuesday night by the PUL community. We're brilliant at acronyms. I had a brother came home from Australia last year to Belfast. He brought his kids home. They'd never been in Northern Ireland. And they were getting the tour around the city, and the tour guide said, you know, Northern Ireland's brilliant for acronyms. We've got the IRA, the UDA, the UVF, the LVF, the INLA, the LFF, but the biggest killer's on your right-hand side, and the whole bus looked round, KFC. But we're good at that. But the point is that that PUL community and the Catholic Nationalist Republican community are on exactly the same page, and they're miles ahead of the elected representatives.
Yeah, sure. So what can civic nationalism do to foster those kind of civic unionist groups? I suppose some unionists are slightly suspicious that civic nationalists are better at arguing than them. So if you ever enter into a debate with somebody that you know is kind of like better prepared or smarter than you, you're a little bit hesitant because you think they're going to kind of talk you into doing something that you don't want to do. So therefore, I think maybe there needs to be a little bit of development for unionism to kind of examine itself, come to terms with some of those difficult questions I mentioned, because I remember talking to like a Republican ex-prisoner a few years ago, and he kind of said like, you know, what happened to you in unionism like happens to most people. You get to this sort of stage of journey, you get to this point of analysis, and you can't reconcile progressive ideals with how unionism sits. Like, you just can't reconcile the two. And then you become uncomfortable and you have to discard one. Either you have to stop being progressive or you have to stop being a unionist. And it's really difficult. So I think that kind of needs to be worked out before you can have those big, tough conversations. You can certainly talk about stuff like what sort of health system would have, or would we keep Stormont, and all those sorts of things. And that's good that that's happening. But the kind of idea of the formation of a new state, like the creation of a nation, like by consent, with all of these kind of different people who have at one point, some have been willing to kill each other, I think that's like a longer term project.
Yeah. I think some of the conversations, assuming that we're heading towards unity, a united Ireland, and we're making those assumptions, I don't make that assumption. I think we're a long way off that. I think our politics are still zero sum. So that what's good for them is bad for us. So if nationalism or republicanism starts to talk about good unionism, and we want good unionism, and we want to talk to good unionism, and we want to see more progressive unionism, then you'll see unionism getting together and shunning progressive unionism. So because that's what happens in a zero-sum situation. I think the biggest thing that we have missed a trick on with the Good Friday Agreement and subsequently assembly after assembly is the civic forum and the collapse of the civic forum. That was one of the main pillars within the Good Friday Agreement. Because if you remember the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement, during the negotiations, civil society played a major role. Trade unions, business, churches, community organisations who've always been involved in the peace process played a massive, massive part in getting the Good Friday Agreement. They didn't dictate what it should look like. They just said, we want an agreement and we want you to reach an agreement and we'll support you in any way we can to get that. I think since then, civic society has sort of melted away. And so these discussions within civic nationalism, civic unionism need to come together again to say, we want Northern Ireland to work. May not want the Assembly to work as it has been working because it's a bit of a, well, can of worms, but we want something. And what is it we want? What is it we want in this part of this island? And how do we make this place work? And I think there are lots of progressive voices in there that would be very willing to have those conversations.
Okay. Can I just add, by the way, I actually didn't have any difficulty with civic nationalism meeting at the Waterfront Hall. I think if you're going to bring the two groups together, there's some sort of, as it were, preparatory work to be done. You need civic nationalism to know where they have one voice and where they have difficulties, and equally with civic unionism, which would probably have more difficulty identifying areas where there's unity. I tried with Peter Robinson, you may remember some years ago, to bring forward a unionist forum. And the difficulty with it, apart from sending out, and now accept a bad message to nationalism, but the difficulty with getting all those people around the table was that you looked around the table and you went, you're here to wreck it, you're here to wreck it, and you're here to wreck it. So it is very difficult. Right, so there's 3 people have indicated, and the first is the guy in the red jacket who's doing a really good impression of Jim Gimley of Sinn Féin.
This is the 5th debate in the programme, Féile's programme, on the issue of Ireland's future and unionist and Protestant community have been well able and debating these issues out in the previous 4, and I can see clearly that that's the direction in which this one is going as well. There's been 11 debates on Ireland's future in relation to whether it's moving towards a transition period, but certainly the notion of a new Ireland is now part of that mix as well. But what I wanted to specifically ask you on the issue of reimagining unionism, what are the big issues inside the unionist community that are currently being discussed, say apart from Brexit? Because 2 issues that the panel mentioned. One was the issue of the health service, the new health service, and the second one was in relation to the subvention. Now, both those issues were debated out here just today on the need for an Irish National Health Service drawn from the British model that was set up in 1942. And the second issue was the issue of the economics of the United Ireland, which addressed the subvention. And the facts that were presented by Paul Gosling and by Pierre Stofferty clearly showed that the notion of a 9 or 10 billion pound subvention is far from mathematically the case. And when he made a presentation that reduced the subvention down to somewhere between 4 and 5 billion. Still a lot of money, but not that headline figure. So those 2 issues were prominent in the debates. I'm just wondering, are there other issues? Are they issues inside the unionist community, or are there other issues that are ongoing at the moment?
Okay, can I take 2 more? Because I think there's a good few people who want. The second man to indicate, yes sir, in the blue shirt.
Thanks. My name is Dougal McCullough, and I have been a member of the Progressive Unionist Party, and it's lovely to hear Dawn's clarity as ever. I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I was raised Protestant in East Belfast, and that means growing up I got to experience the identity of being British on this island and being unionist, because it was expected. And most people have that experience wherever they live in the world, socialised into the culture. I want to say something personal about what I experienced there, which was to say the identity meant that in relation to others, the key people who you looked up to were English. And you got a sense that you're not as good as the English. And then there was the compensation, but at least you're not a Catholic. That wasn't asked for or sought. There's nothing to do with me personally, but it's internalized from the culture. And we all have our varieties of this kind of nonsense misinformation. We get as, I'm a man, therefore I'm somehow intangibly, indefinably better than a woman. Nothing to do with me personally, it comes with the territory. Most of us in this room are white. More bullshit. So, given this is, then we are born into historical circumstances, not of our choosing again. And what I was born into in terms of unionist culture has been continuous crisis. So the insecurity that I saw in the culture I grew up in, and I was protected from this to a large degree because I was relatively middle class. But the crisis in identity leads to that tremendous insecurity, which has been expressed in Protestant culture with the Boer mentality of always being on the defensive and not being able to be relaxed and at home in the land that we're born in. You know, like, to be at home in the land you're born in, what a treat that would be. Whenever you get the message of Brits out and other messages during the process of growing up. Like Sammy Wilson was in school with me. I went to Bethany, he was the same class, and Sammy used to pin on the front of his desk when David Blakely was teaching us politics a Union Jack. And whenever Sammy and I had paths have crossed in the years since in conversations. But the idea that I'm, throughout my personal life, struggling to claim my Irishness and finding that a very interesting challenge. The message I get would be, what are you talking about? You're not Irish or British, what are you talking about? The message from loyalism to me. And I got a similar message, by the way, from the Republican movement. You're not Irish or British. So this insecurity, which is expressed at a personal level and a cultural level, unionism's a crisis. So I want to just move to, that'll take a long time, but to move to the level of the larger crisis what Brexit is creating and the rise of English nationalism. I used to think, what the freak kind of insult is Theresa May saying when she said Brexit means Brexit? Like, give us a clue. And I now realise it means English nationalism. And that's what it means. And the expression of English nationalism, I think, is inevitable and necessary because they've lost it in the sense of Britishness.
Is there a question?
So the point I was getting to is about leadership, which has been lacking in the crisis and the insecurity of the culture of unionism. And the future is how are you going to lead the unionist people given this continuous crisis?
Okay, gentlemen, 4 rows back, yes, and
Thank you very much. To be honest, the people in the panel, and this gentleman up here has been talking about the sort of things that I've been wrestling with for years, being right. I actually grew up in a Protestant working class area. My father's people from East Street. I grew up in Craig. I may have said this before, so I like to talk about this. I'm a year younger than George K.S. I've been a year younger, given him a chance.
You lived at Taylor, right?
Pardon?
You lived at Taylor, right?
To be honest, his was the tragedy that he shows is actually the tragedy of working class unionism as well. There's so many lost talents. And I'm not interested in isms. I'm interested in creating a society which releases the talents of all the people in this society. And hanging your hat on an ism isn't doing that. It hasn't done it. And I actually now live down near Donegal. And as an interest point, people here talk about unionism and they see an image of unionism. Donegal in 1798 declared itself an independent republic.
and nobody noticed.
But actually, down in Bangor, actually, again, Bangor, after the collapse of the rebellion, the last people executed after the rebellion were hung on the pier at Bangor. Now, the point I'm making is people in unionism do not know that in general because they've had imposed amnesia. This society has been created the way it is by divide and rule by the Anglo elites who ran it. It wasn't themans, it wasn't us'ns, it was thos'ns. And they have created the divide here. And for the people being divided, it's not a case, we don't rule. It's a case of divide and rule, and that's what's being done to this society.
Okay, appreciate that. Now, the panel, I'm going to give the panel a chance to come back. Just on your point about, if we go down to the maternity unit down the road, the next child to be born will be a boy or a girl, and we'll know how relatively healthy they are. And that's about all we'll know, except inside that child is a spark of ability, creativity, talent. And it's our job, it is our job to let them find out what that is. And that's all that really, really matters if we're going to have a mature society.
In a healthy society, that talent is released naturally.
Yeah.
here because of the repression in this
Yeah,
society.
the point's made. Dawn, do you want to go? We'll just go straight down the line.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying, so I don't think there was a question there. I think it was more.
The question would be, who won the World Cup in 1938?
That was Uruguay.
Yeah. My granda would have told me, but he's not here. It was Donegal.
Seconds.
I'll come to Jim's question first. I don't think it's up to unionism to solve your vision of a united Ireland. I don't think you ask unionism what a united Ireland looks like. I think you come up with a vision of what a united Ireland looks like, and you try and persuade people towards that. And they ask someone who is not in agreement with a united Ireland, they ask someone who would be politically opposed to a united Ireland to say, what are your issues and how can we resolve them, is basically saying to somebody, here's the tools, you build it yourself. And I'm not prepared as a unionist to come that far with you to build your united Ireland, because it's not what I want. The conversation that I want to have about this island is the future of relationships on this island. What the relationships in Northern Ireland look like, how we share this space, how we work together, how we govern this place. What does our health service look like now in Northern Ireland, and what help does it need? You know, are we getting enough subvention from Westminster in order to support our public services here? Look at the state of our education system. We have 4 sectors in our education system. It's segregated along religious lines, language lines, and A and other. You know, these are the issues that I want to talk about and how we resolve those. I have no interest in talking about whether we want an Irish National Health Service. None whatsoever. And I think until we can have those conversations about resolving how we govern this place and the relationships in this place, I think we're a long way off from having those other conversations. In terms of the question about identity and the identity crisis, unionism has always had an identity crisis. Always, 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 as long as I can remember. And it became more stark, I think, during the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement, because unionism's looking at the British government and saying, you need to back us, you need to support us, you need to be the, you know, and then again, the British government would have betrayed them, and oh, bad old betraying British government. You know, nationalism was looking at the Irish government, you support us through this talks process. And of course the Irish government, seeing other parties in the talks as competitors, go and do the complete opposite thing. And and then at the very least you're supposed to be a neutral broker, you know, an honest broker. It's never been an honest broker. Irish government's never been an honest broker. The British government's never been an honest broker in any of the discussions about the future on this island. So there is an identity crisis within unionism, and it has always been there. And I agree with Mike. The irony of the DUP as turkeys voting for Christmas will lead to the breakup of the union. And unionism is going to be in a much worse state than what it is now, because Scotland will be Scottish, England will be English, Welsh will be Welsh,
Irish will be Irish.
Irish will be Irish. And what will unionism be? British. And what is Britain? What is British? What does it mean? What does it mean? So there's going to be a massive crisis, I think, and there's been no leadership, I think, shown within political unionism in dealing with that crisis of identity and trying to prepare people for what's coming down the line. And we will end up with the Millwall Supporters Club. And this is why I talk about this isolationist policy and this isolationist. So we'll sit in this wee corner, and if nobody likes us, well, then they can go away, because this is where we're going to sit and this is what we're going to hold on to. We'll circle the wagons and we'll sit like this. No, we need to move out, we need to talk, we need to have those conversations, and that's why I talk about my unionism is not like DUP unionism, right? DUP unionism is anti-everything, mine is pro-everything, but it's how we make this place work and how we make relationships in this island work.
Yeah.
I think, Jim, to answer your question first, I'd go back to Donald Rumsfeld, the Gulf War, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. Unfortunately, Brexit has created, and the Irish unity discussion has created, a whole plethora of experts what we really need to do here is dispel the myths and get to some of the facts about really what this looks like. Because, for example, on the costs and the financials, we've heard the 10 billion subvention. I listened to Pierce destroy it. I've spoken to Queen's to academics and experts who've said actually both sides are wrong. And until we get rid of the fluff and the bluster and work out what it looks like, because there's going to be some of the messaging is going to be fairly unpalatable, but there's going to be some very supportive of Irish unity. So we need to give people the facts. I think when we look at things like the demographics, and I spoke to loyalist paramilitary leaders, and we had this conversation about the demographics in Northern Ireland, and it is changing. But I spoke to an academic last week who says be very careful about the figures, because he says births of Catholics in Northern Ireland is confused a bit by the fact we've got 300,000 Polish nationals. We've got 48,000 new registrations of births of Catholics. Young Protestants have they found now are less likely to find themselves as being Protestant. They'll put a blank, whereas young Catholics will be more predisposed to defining themselves as a Catholic because there's still the influence of the church in that family structure. So I think it's important we get the facts. With regard to leadership, it's interesting the leadership, because when I was elected to the Senate, and I'll not name them because I'll not embarrass them, the leaders of political unionism supported me and said the time's right. It's right that you're in Leinster House, you're the right person, we support you. And every one of them, and I say I'll not name them, embarrass them, every one of them when I said, so will you tell your people, can't do that, Ian, we'll lose votes. That's where we are. That's the insecurity we have in political unionism. And when we talk about insecurity and identity, it's interesting. I'm 51 years old, born in 1968 in South Armagh. I went to a Protestant grammar school. And the identity thing's interesting because I've listened to people say that the symbols and we're desperate on flags and colours and emblems and symbols in Northern Ireland. But things were weaponised, and that's just by default how it happened. Because when I was a young fella in the 80s at a Protestant grammar school, I would have burnt the Irish flag because it was anti-Prod, anti-Brit, anti-Union. Now, it wasn't until I went to Leinster House I realised it was 1848, symbolising green for nationalism, orange for Protestantism, white for peace. I've asked at least 10 people in the last 6 months, did they know the history of the Irish flag? Do you know the only man that could tell me what it was a loyalist paramilitary leader in East Belfast. Nobody, even the Catholic nationalist Republicans around home that I've asked, couldn't tell me the history of the flag, but they knew it represented something. So I think that's important. There's another thing I think you need to understand, and it came on the back of a conversation I had when I was running for the Senate election, a conversation I had with Mary Lou MacDonald. And at one point in our conversation, I said to her, you know, Mary Lou, I could subscribe to Irish Unity. And she says, what? Could you, Ian? I says, yeah, we have a 32-county Ireland, we run it from London. Damn, she says, you were going so well until you got to the end. But there's a serious side to that story, because if I say to this audience today, what about a 32-county Ireland and we run her from London? That's reprehensible to you all. Put your place in that place, because that's where unionists, many of them today, are with Irish Unity. We have listened to a United Ireland as a slogan against unionism for years. So unity and United Ireland doesn't work for unions. Shared future, agreed future, a lot of this is about sensitivities around language, and we're all created by the 40 years.
Sophie.
Why not run it from Belfast?
Well, at the minute, go by the last 3 years of leadership. Ask yourself, I'll not answer that.
Paul's figures say that instead of costing them 10 billion, we only cost 5 billion, so Northern Ireland is half price. That's good news for everybody, but like still expensive at half the price. Fine, absolutely fine. And if I agree with Bernadette when she says you don't want to weld two dysfunctional states together and create an even more dysfunctional state. If everything's on the table, everything's on the table. So I'd want to talk about stuff like properly taxing corporations, having some form of universal income for everybody, and moving away from the kind of neoliberal model that we've attempted and hasn't worked. Because if you care about, for example, if you care about desegregating education here so that every child can thrive, then you should also care about children in Yemen who are being killed by BAE weapon systems, which the British state are profiting from. So you have to care about everybody. What are the big issues inside unionism in relation to Irish unification? The biggest ones are probably they don't really feel welcome and valued in a Northern Irish setting. so they don't see how that would change if you just lifted the border away. And that's not just in terms of, okay, you can parade here, okay, you can parade there. Like, the band scene is a big kind of cultural institution within a lot of working class areas, and it's something that like young men in particular see as a way of transmitting values and solidarity and talent across generations and bringing people together. And for that to be framed in a very negative way is incredibly hurtful. So yes, there's totally work to be done in terms of like showing respect when you're going past certain streets and certain buildings and institutions. But you do need to be able to see those practices from the perspective of the people that do them for free, in the rain, in the sun, all year round. The other big issue, I think, is under what circumstances would Irish republicanism return to violence? And what methods do we now have of resolving our differences, which mean that that won't happen? Because, as I said, unionism has never really examined publicly the structural conditions which gave rise to Irish Republican violence, like openly, probably privately. I know a lot of ex-prisoners have. But some sort of public commitment to non-violence from everybody, I think, is really important. The things which would be important to me would be the fact that every 30 seconds or so, the PSNI attend a domestic violence incident. So if we're going to have an Irish state, we need to also make sure it's not a patriarchal state. But that's a much more difficult thing. But there is that potential there, because there are different strands of Irish republicanism which all have like a lot of kind of radical and creative political thought. So if you want to have, you know, an anti-militarist, feminist, socialist society of some kind, which means that we're now, within which we could probably properly respond to the climate crisis, then absolutely, you know, now is the time to do it. We've got 11 years to save the planet, so we could probably fix Northern Ireland in the meantime. So yeah, those are the things I'd be concerned about.
Four people have indicated, and I'm conscious we're probably going into the last round. Can I just say just first, though, Dougal mentioned leadership. Two of the greatest acts of leadership I think I've ever seen came in this decade and in Dublin. And the first was the Queen, what she did and said, and I think particularly of this notion of we could all wish there were things we did differently or not at all. And the other was last year when the Taoiseach welcomed the Pope in Dublin Castle. And I paraphrase here, but what I felt he was saying to Pope Francis was, Your Holiness, you're really, really welcome. I'm so glad you're here. But don't be touching anything, because it's not yours anymore. Do you know? No particular faction or group owns the Republic anymore. And no group or faction owns Northern Ireland anymore. And unionists need to get their head around that. It doesn't mean a united Ireland is inevitable, but it does mean if we get cryogenically frozen and come back in 5, 15 or 50 years, there'll still be Republicans, nationalists, unionists, loyalists and others. So how do we turn that into an advantage and make diversity a strength? Monica.
The title was Reimagining, and I really welcome contributions from An Phobail and colleagues, formerly, a long time, 20 years ago, from the Women's Coalition, as a number of Sophie. I was very interested in you reflecting back on Norman Porter's book, Rethinking Unionism. My question is this. Was there a time when that book could be written and wasn't heard within unionism? Has the time come to hear some of that now? Does it take a crisis like Brexit or any of the other issues that we're facing to make us learn and adapt? So the issue I would like you to really reflect on is, was the Civic Forum before its time, and is it now a crisis that has brought us, as it did in the Republic, to listen and hear from citizens? Was the Bill of Rights, which if you tap it into Google, to Ulster Scots, comes up as a Bill of Rights, was that before its time? Why was it not heard in the way it could have been? I once went to you, Mike, when I was obviously after I drafted as part of the Chief Commissioner of Human Rights, and wrote about the political history of the parties here in Northern Ireland supporting it and the unionism disowning it. you have in terms of reflecting on your own progression in relation to rights issues.
Okay. Gentleman in the green right at the back row was next.
Thank you. Somebody said it used to be work. I don't represent any political party or whatever. I am a Protestant, so you can go and talk about. I do worry a lot about unionism and the future, and I see and hear conversations most days, most weeks, and the lack of leadership, worry about. We know 50 plus 1 isn't coming, we know it's here now, and we need our leaders to recognise that and plan for the future, which is a law learn of one type, and we need to know what it's going to look like and what's in it for us.
Okay. Did you want to come in, or was that a previous?
Actually, somebody else asked it, but it wasn't fully answered.
Well, never is.
Or it wasn't answered at all.
It's just very, very short question. If we can ever agree on it, there's an anniversary coming up, the 100th year since the foundation of the Northern State, or the Orange State as I always called it. So,
Where's that then?
the question is this, and simple yes or no, did the statelet of Northern Ireland serve the interest of the people who lived here? And if it didn't, then we need to move on to a new conversation. How do we go on?
Thanks very much. Wonderful presentations, thank you. It's just a very short question. I'll put it in the audience as well. I was coming around the roundabout at Donegal Road, and in front of me was a Transit bus, and on the bottom was an advert for the William and Mary Bill of Rights. I never knew there was one, but I thought it was fantastic advertising, and I thought maybe it wasn't serious until I looked up Wikipedia and saw that indeed.
King William.
Highly influential, absolutely critical, but it's the first time I've seen it. The bus moved off too quickly for me to see who put the advert up. Does anybody know who did that?
I don't, but I think it was 1698 was King William, the Bill of Rights. 89. Right. Okay, I think we're just going to have final comments, so we'll start with Sophie and make our way along. And thank you for persevering in the heat.
I'll try and be quick because I know the leaders' debate's going on soon. Let's see. So, yeah, all those questions by Monica, I would need to think through carefully to give you a proper answer. But yeah, I think some of those institutions and some of that contribution from Porter were before their time, and I think that there's now been a turn towards more democracy rather than less. So the model used during the talks meant that the smaller parties were represented, and that was successful then, and we've now trimmed down the assembly so it's less representative, and we've lost the civic forum. So, and we now have a kind of two-party deadlock. So we've narrowed everything down from where we started out and what was successful. However, because of the information revolution, because of different post-colonial movements, because of different moves towards democracy in the Middle East, people now want to be more involved in decision making rather than less, and people are now more confident in the fact that they have something to contribute. So the idea of having experiential knowledge is now recognised as opposed to having some sort of formal training. So therefore, I think we could take texts maybe like Porter's, and maybe, like if people were open to it, Principles of Loyalism is a really interesting document. So I think that might be a useful setting for some sort of civic conversations or salon type discussions where we can kind of explore unionist political thought, because there is a lot of unionist political thought, it just doesn't get recognised much. The lack of leadership in unionism and the fact that we haven't been planning, again, it's just short-termism, like there's no strategic thinking, it's always tactical and it's defensive, and it's tragic because when people do try to look beyond the next electoral cycle and think maybe even in terms of just one generation, they get accused of kind of a range of things and then they kind of get pushed out. So unless you're going to defend the union right now, you should shut up. Did Northern Ireland serve the interests of the people who live here? Does any capitalist economy serve the interests of everybody that lives there? No. Yeah, one here.
I suppose on the question, first thing, the thing about the everything has a right time. I'm not sure everything has a right time, but everything definitely has a best time that you look at it. The Civic Forum, Monica, you know, I look at that and I think it was ahead of its time. When I look at the executive or the lack of an executive at the moment, and I look at the work in the Senate, and I look at my experience being in Westminster in an upper house, I think what we need up on the hill is an upper house. Because actually you can have your debate, your green and orange discussion on the floor of a lower house, you pass it to an upper house, you diffuse it, you scrutinise it, you look at it, you amend it, you change it, you put it back. You give the people in the lower house the latitude to govern and do what they're elected to do without being seen as being weak or giving and conceding ground to the other side. So, and I think when we look at, you talk about things before their time, Eames Bradley was 2007, 2008. Go back and read Eames Bradley. Eames Bradley is appropriate now. Now, it's not perfect, it needs amended, it needs bits and pieces changed, but Eames Bradley was a classic document that was way ahead of its time. Northern Ireland wasn't ready for it at that time. When you look at the 50+1 reference, it's interesting because, and I understand the Good Friday Agreement, I understand 50+1, but the reality is for me it's not about 50+1, it's what the hell you do with the 49% that don't agree with it on day two. Because that's your problem, and that's why you've got to have this discussion, because it's not about, I'm not worried about 50.1, I'm not nervous or very insecure about it, but the reality for me is what on earth would do after that, because if we don't bring everybody in Northern Ireland with us in this journey, and if we leave 500 people in East Belfast disadvantaged and feeling isolated, beyond no illusion, there's a serious risk that we go into anarchy. Finally, on the question of the state, it's easy to sit here and lambast and criticise our forefathers and our politicians that went before us. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. With the benefit of hindsight, we'd all do things differently. I think the important thing is that we learn from our mistakes and we don't repeat them, and that's the important stuff.
David Porter's book, I think, yes, was way ahead of its time. I think we have a number of people who were involved in those discussions at the time that were way ahead of their time. And I can't remember who said it, but that the Good Friday Agreement was something for slow learners. And I think, you know, devolution and the formation of an executive and the change in face of politics in Northern Ireland has always been for slow learners. And Ian mentioned Eames Bradley. I've been involved in an organisation called Healing Through Remembering since 2006 that looks at how we deal with the legacy of the conflict in Northern Ireland. Healing Through Remembering has produced lots of research and discussion documents, and Claire's involved with it too, on how we come together and deal with legacy issues. And when I first started this conversation, it was shut it down, pull the shutter down, draw a line in the sand, move forward. We can't discuss this, it's too painful, it's too sore, we need to move on. I came to a completely different view in engaging with people from all different backgrounds, that we need to deal with this. But it took me a while. And when I was involved in those conversations, there was no political leaders involved in those conversations. Eames Bradley came on the scene and there was more and more conversations. Then we had the Stormont House Agreement and there's more and more conversations. So it takes a while, it takes time, decades for people to have discussions, to change and to debate. And I think we are in a position now where we need to talk about civic plenums or civic forum or civic discussions. We talked about earlier civic nationalism, civic unionism, but the more that we have an absence of governance here in Northern Ireland, we need citizens to be involved in how we shape our society and what it looks like going forward, because we've heard the warning signs about Brexit that we're going to get some form of direct rule on the 31st of October. If we get direct rule, that's all decision-making power removed from us completely, and we need to make sure that there's something in place where we have our say. I think civic forum, I think a Bill of Rights, equality, these are all issues that our society needs to be based on going forward, and there needs to be protections in place. For unionism to get to grips with that crisis of identity and that ever-shrinking identity, there has to be planning. There has to be some form of leadership shown. The isolationist stuff has not worked. I always talked about unionism being on a sort of a continuum, with progressive unionist left of centre politics here, and right-wing isolationist, very nationalist sort of Jim Allister politics here. And we all want the same thing. We all want to live in the union, but we just disagree at what that union looks like and how we go about achieving it. And on this end, it's about isolationism. It's about we hate people, we don't like people, we're anti-people, and we don't want, we all use nasty people, just go away and we live here nicely. Whereas on this end, and I think the people in this panel are on this end, is we have got to work out what our relationships look like. We have got to share this space together, and we've got to create a society that we all want to live in. That continuum, I think, is changing, and increasingly people at this end of the continuum are being more and more isolated because unionism, and I'm talking about the electorate, are not voting in those numbers anymore. And people towards this end are going, who do I vote for? There's nobody there that represents me. Who do I vote for? And so this is where the discussion and the debate is happening. But up here, it's getting more and more isolated and the wagons are circling. And this is where the debate and the discussion needs to happen about that planning, as you say, planning for the future. Did partition serve the people? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I agree with Bernadette McCalliskey. Can you weld two peoples together that have grown up in separate development over this many years? No, you can't do it. It's going to be mucked up. So let's work on this first, and then let's see what the rest of the relationships look like. I don't know who put it on the bus, but it's a great idea.
I suppose the brief answer, Monica, to your question is yes, there were things that were ahead of their time. And actually, I think there's a lot of merit in the political parties just revisiting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, because at the time, the opponents of the agreement, of course, within unionism, poked all the emotional buttons. It was all about the transitional arrangements, the prisoner releases, decommissioning, and reform of the police service. That's all been done. So in 2019, you can only focus on the values, which begin with relationships. Do we want to have relationships based on tolerance, reconciliation, trust, and respect? And I certainly do. So I think there would be some merit in that. Really interesting question, did the state serve the people? I think the answer is obvious, but the big question is, what are the lessons for the future? Because certainly Brexit has put the constitutional question back on the political agenda. I don't know where that goes. Geography isn't destiny. A united Ireland is not inevitable, but the debate is. And when I was at the debate here at Féile last year, I made the point that I've heard nationalists and Republicans say they want a united Ireland. That's your right. I've heard people like Mary Lou say in that event we must protect unionist interests. That's great. But what I haven't heard is nationalists and Republicans saying, we want you in the new dispensation, and here's why. And let me be clear, I get the incredible irony of me as a unionist saying that, where we ran this country for 51 years, and not once did we say to you, we want you in Northern Ireland, and here's why. So all I would say is, let's not make the same mistake going forward, because we're going to have that debate. We're going to have to finish now. Thank you all very much. Can I just point out, by the way, there was a food outlet mentioned earlier on, and Slugger O'Toole would like to make clear it was Katrina's Fish and Chips, and not a highly litigious multinational by the same initials. Thank you very much. All the best.